It was the year 1621, and the sun cast its final crimson light over the palace at the heart of Paris. In the great halls of the Bourbon monarchy, preparations for a royal wedding were underway, a union that would soon reverberate across the courts of Europe. Elisabeth de Bourbon, the eldest daughter of Henri IV of France and Marie de Medici, stood before the grand mirror in her chambers, the weight of her impending marriage to King Philip IV of Spain heavy on her young shoulders. She had been raised in the lap of French royalty, but now she was stepping into the gilded world of Spanish power, a world where the language of diplomacy was sharp, the politics ruthless, and the court teemed with intrigue. Her marriage had been carefully arranged, not for love, but for political gain. Philip IV, already entrenched in the delicate dance of Spanish absolutism, needed an heir to secure the future of the Habsburg dynasty. Elisabeth, a princess of France, was seen as the perfect tool to bridge the gap between the two great nations. But as the days drew closer to the wedding, Elisabeth found herself torn between duty and desire, between the girl she had been and the queen she was destined to become. Little did she know, her actions over the coming decades would not only shape the destiny of the Spanish Empire, but also that of Europe itself. Elisabeth de Bourbon was just a girl of 15 when the decision was made, her marriage to Philip IV of Spain. It was the kind of arrangement that shaped dynasties, born not of love but of cold calculation. Elizabeth's marriage to the young King of Spain was a union of kingdoms, a strategic alliance designed to strengthen ties between France and Spain. Her father, Henri IV of France, had always known the power of strategic marriages, and as a king who had ascended the throne only a few years earlier, he understood that his dynasty would be made or broken on the international stage. By aligning with the mighty Habsburgs of Spain, Henri hoped to create a buffer between his kingdom and Spain's imperial ambitions. He also hoped that the union would bring lasting peace, an end to the long-standing rivalries that had defined French-Spanish relations. Elizabeth, however, had never considered her life as a pawn in this great geopolitical game. The world she knew was one of beauty, privilege, and the quiet hum of court life. Paris, the heart of France, was a place of brilliance, a place where her mother, Marie de Medici, kept the court alive with extravagant events and intrigues. Elizabeth's childhood had been one of indulgence, filled with beautiful dresses, banquets, and the steady guidance of tutors who had instilled in her an appreciation for French culture and history. Her father, Henri IV, though often absent due to his political duties, had been a figure of great admiration to her, a king who had once been a Protestant and then converted to Catholicism to secure his throne. Henri was seen as a pragmatist, a king who understood the importance of alliances, both within France and beyond its borders. Despite the lavish surroundings, Elizabeth's heart was not set on the politics of power. She dreamed of a different life, one where her happiness might lie not in diplomatic exchanges or royal duties, but in love, the notion that her future had already been decided, that her destiny was etched in stone, felt like an invisible hand resting heavily on her chest. When the news of her impending marriage to Philip IV reached her, Elizabeth had to suppress the rising panic in her heart. She was to leave the comforts of the French court and travel to Spain, a foreign land she had heard little of except in the context of her father's diplomatic dealings. And there, in the heart of Madrid, she would marry a man she had never met, a king whose personality and desires were largely unknown to her. The political motives behind this union were clear enough. Philip IV needed a queen consort, and the Bourbon family, fresh from its recent rise to power, needed the legitimacy that such a marriage would bring. But to Elizabeth, it felt as though her life was being dictated by forces outside her control. She could not yet understand the weight of her role. She could not know how deeply her actions would affect not only the fate of Spain but that of all of Europe. The journey to Spain was both a literal and metaphorical crossing into an unknown world. As Elizabeth sailed across the Mediterranean Sea, her thoughts swirled with unease and anticipation. She wondered what Spain would be like, what her husband would be like, and whether this was her fate, an obedient pawn in the political games of kings. For days, the sea stretched endlessly before her, an open expanse that mirrored her own uncertainty. When Elisabeth finally arrived in Spain, the reality of her situation began to settle in. Madrid, though impressive in its grand architecture and sprawling palaces, felt colder than Paris. The air was dry and sharp, the landscape flat and barren compared to the fertile greenery of France. The Spanish court was unlike the vibrant and dynamic court of her native land. There was an air of formality, even stiffness, in the way people moved, as though the weight of centuries of power had borne down on the court and drained it of its energy. The Spanish people, too, were distant. They looked upon the foreign princess with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, aware that she was the product of an alliance, not of shared history or mutual love. Elisabeth's arrival did little to alleviate the discontent that simmered beneath the surface of the Spanish court. The kingdom, though vast, was beset by problems. The wars in the Netherlands and Italy were draining Spain's resources. The treasury was empty, the soldiers unpaid, and unrest spread throughout the empire. Philip IV's reign, though young, was already facing challenges that threatened to undo everything his ancestors had built. Elisabeth's first meeting with Philip IV was an encounter that left her with more questions than answers. The king, though handsome and regal, appeared aloof and distant. Philip was not the passionate and fiery monarch she had imagined. Instead, he seemed distant, almost disconnected from the world around him. As they exchanged pleasantries, Elisabeth could not help but feel the absence of warmth in his demeanor. There were no words of welcome or affection, only the cold formality that came with royal obligation. She had expected a king, a man of power and purpose, but what she encountered was a figure weighed down by responsibility, a king who seemed more a prisoner of his own position than its master. Their marriage was not one of immediate love, and Elisabeth soon realized that the political ramifications of this union would overshadow any personal connection she might hope to develop. Philip, though a king in title, was far from being a king in command. His reign had been marked by a series of military failures, the collapse of Spain's once immense financial empire, and increasing unrest among the Spanish nobility. In a sense, Philip IV was more a figurehead than a ruler. The real power in Spain lay with the ministers and advisors who guided him, and Elisabeth quickly realized that if she was to play a meaningful role in this court, it would have to be through her own influence rather than through her husband's leadership. She spent her early days in Madrid learning the intricacies of court life, navigating the complex web of politics that defined Spanish nobility. Despite the emotional distance she felt from Philip, Elisabeth saw her role as queen as crucial to the survival of the Spanish monarchy. She understood that her influence, though subtle, was perhaps the only thing that could preserve the power of the Habsburg dynasty. In a court that was filled with ambitious ministers and scheming noblemen, Elisabeth had to tread carefully, always aware of the delicate balance between loyalty and self-preservation. But Spain was a kingdom in decline, and Elisabeth found herself increasingly isolated. She had left behind the bustling, vibrant court of Paris, where intrigue and social activity were the pulse of life, only to step into a kingdom where the court was drained of energy, where the king's mind was preoccupied with his own inner turmoil, and where the nobility was struggling to maintain its grip on power. In the early years of her marriage, Elisabeth took on the role of consort with quiet determination. She knew that her position was precarious. She was, in many ways, an outsider born in France. Now Queen of Spain, she was expected to produce an heir to the throne, a task that had become more urgent with every passing year. Philip, whose emotional distance had kept him from taking an active role in his kingdom's affairs, looked to Elisabeth for support. She became the bridge between the court's factions, the person through whom decisions were often made, even if her voice was rarely heard in the official councils. It was in this delicate balance of power, one where she had little formal authority but much informal influence, that Elisabeth began to carve out her own space. She began to understand that her role was not just to be the wife of a king, but to be a queen in her own right, shaping the destiny of a kingdom that seemed increasingly on the verge of collapse. The challenges she faced were many: the court's intrigues, Philip's personal apathy, and the ever-present tension between France and Spain weighed heavily on her. But Elisabeth was not a woman who would fade into the background. She knew that the future of the Spanish Empire depended on her ability to influence the king, guide the court, and secure the throne for the next generation. The path ahead was uncertain, and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. But Elisabeth de Bourbon was no longer the young princess who had sailed from Paris with only a dream of love. She was now the Queen of Spain, and the weight of the crown was hers to bear. The months that followed Elisabeth's arrival in Madrid were a whirlwind of rituals, court ceremonies, and endless formalities. As a young queen consort, she was expected to project the image of grace, composure, and power. Despite her internal turmoil, the cold walls of the Spanish palace seemed to mirror the isolation she felt, as though the court itself had wrapped itself in a cloak of secrecy and distance, a world separate from the vibrancy of the French court she had left behind. In those early days, Elisabeth was much more than just a queen by title. She was an outsider in a foreign land, an untested woman navigating the intricacies of a decaying empire. Her marriage to Philip IV, though politically significant, was not the passionate union that fairy tales promised. The king's aloofness only deepened Elisabeth's sense of alienation. Philip, though a man of undeniable charm and regal bearing, was burdened by the immense weight of ruling a vast, crumbling empire. He had inherited a kingdom in turmoil, an empire stretched thin by costly wars, economic collapse, and the increasing decay of the Habsburgs' once unified rule. His reign was overshadowed by these tensions, and though he outwardly carried himself with dignity, Elisabeth soon realized that Philip was a man often lost in his own thoughts, consumed by the politics of the court and the loneliness of his position. First, Elisabeth struggled with her new role. She had been raised to understand the power of diplomacy and the importance of alliances, but she had not been prepared for the reality of being a foreign queen in a foreign court. The Spanish nobility was a complex, fractured entity divided by region, tradition, and loyalty. There were factions within the court that vied for Philip's favor, each seeking to manipulate the king to further their own agendas. To Elisabeth, the court was a battlefield, one in which she was an unwilling player at first, unsure of how to navigate the complex web of intrigue that seemed to ensnare everything and everyone. Her relationship with Philip was the cornerstone of her political influence, but it was also a source of immense frustration. Though he was kind and attentive on the rare occasions when he engaged with her, Philip rarely sought her counsel. The king was deeply engrossed in his own passions, his mind often consumed by his love for art, culture, and the intellectuals who populated the royal court. Philip had cultivated a vibrant artistic circle, hosting painters like Diego Velázquez and poets who admired his patronage. But this devotion to the arts often left his governance neglected. The administration of the empire was left to a circle of ministers who had their own ambitions, and their influence over the king was growing. Philip's detachment was more than just a personal flaw, it was a reflection of a greater problem. Spain was in decline, and the king, unable to grasp the full scale of the crises before him, often retreated into the world of his art and intellectual pursuits. His indecision, exacerbated by a lack of personal connection to his queen, only made matters worse. Elisabeth, who had come to Spain with the hope of supporting her husband and strengthening the empire, quickly saw that she would have to take matters into her own hands. If she was to be of any use in this court, she would need to find a way to influence not just her husband but the very heart of the Spanish monarchy. The task was daunting, and Elisabeth was painfully aware of the fragility of her position. Unlike her French counterparts, who were often more assertive in their roles, Elizabeth's place at the Spanish court was precarious. She was the daughter of Henri IV of France, a kingdom with its own ambitions, but she was now married to a king whose realm was vast, yet fractured. Her duty was clear: to provide Spain with an heir, a male successor who could secure the dynasty and, by extension, the future of the Habsburgs in Spain. However, despite her commitment to her royal duties, Elizabeth found that bearing an heir to the throne was not as simple as fulfilling an obligation. Her relationship with Philip remained distant, and despite her best efforts, the connection she longed for was simply not there. Elizabeth's days were filled with a strict regimen of royal duties, ceremonial obligations, and court appearances, all designed to solidify her image as the queen consort. But beneath this outward composure, she struggled with the emotional toll of her situation. The loneliness she felt within the walls of the Spanish palace was profound. She often sought solace in the company of her ladies-in-waiting, those few women at court who had become her confidants. Yet even they could not ease the sense of isolation that consumed her. Elizabeth was a woman with a keen mind and a strong will, but she was also a woman in a foreign land, married to a king who seemed both inaccessible and, at times, emotionally distant. It was during this time of emotional isolation that Elizabeth began to take on a more active role in the governance of Spain. She had never been one to simply sit by and watch as the wheels of power turned around her. The art of diplomacy was ingrained in her from a young age, and while she had not been trained to rule, she had been trained to influence. She began to take the counsel of the ministers more seriously, subtly inserting herself into the decisions of state and quietly gaining the trust of key figures within the court. Elizabeth's beauty and grace made her a popular figure at court, but it was her intellect and political acumen that began to earn her the respect of those who truly held power. While Philip remained largely absent from the decision-making process, Elizabeth found that her own influence was growing. Her ability to mediate between the various factions at court, to smooth over rivalries and tensions, became a valuable asset. She realized that the only way to gain Philip's favor was not through overt acts of influence, but through quiet, calculated moves that secured the support of the powerful men who surrounded him. She would become the queen behind the king, a silent force shaping the future of Spain with her delicate touch. One of the first major challenges Elizabeth faced was the question of succession. Spain's future depended on securing a male heir, and the pressure to produce one weighed heavily on her. The Spanish court was rife with rumors and expectations, and the women of the court, many of whom had their own ambitions for their families, whispered behind Elizabeth's back. The arrival of a child would not only cement her position at court, but would also be a statement of her power and influence within the Habsburg dynasty. Yet, despite her best efforts, the conception of an heir proved more elusive than Elizabeth had hoped. During the early years of their marriage, Elizabeth's relationship with Philip remained cordial but distant. There were moments of tenderness, but they were fleeting, and the absence of true intimacy began to eat away at Elizabeth's confidence. She began to question whether her marriage, forged in the fires of diplomacy, would ever become more than a political contract. The pressure to provide an heir became all-consuming, and yet the king's indifference made it feel like a task that was hers alone to bear. The Spanish court, ever critical and ever eager to whisper, began to take notice of her struggles. The idea that she might not be able to fulfill her role as queen was an uncomfortable reality, and Elizabeth began to feel the weight of that judgment from those around her. Yet, despite the emotional toll, Elizabeth remained determined. She had come to Spain with a clear sense of duty, and that duty was still her guiding star. She would not allow herself to be defined by the whispers of the court or the distant nature of her marriage. She had learned, through the slow, grinding passage of time, that her power lay not in the grand gestures of a passionate queen, but in the subtle influence she wielded behind closed doors. Elizabeth would fight for Spain's future, even if it meant doing so from the shadows, far from the limelight that her position as queen would suggest. As the years passed, Elizabeth's influence at court only grew. Her relationships with key ministers became more solid, and she found herself acting as a mediator in political disputes, smoothing over tensions between the crown and the nobility. Yet the strain of her marriage continued to weigh heavily on her heart. Philip IV's coldness persisted, and Elizabeth began to wonder if their union was destined to remain one of convenience, a partnership built not on love but on the rigid demands of statecraft. As Spain faced greater challenges from within and without, Elizabeth knew that the fate of the empire might one day depend on her ability to navigate the treacherous waters of courtly politics, where loyalty was fleeting and power was often a game of shadows. The days turned into months, and the months into years, but still Elizabeth felt as if she were treading water in an uncertain world. The Spanish court, with all its formalities, intrigues, and politics, was a place where alliances were made and broken with the turn of a coin, where trust was a currency more precious than gold. Yet for all her struggles, Elizabeth's resolve remained unshaken. She had been raised to understand the value of power, not just the power of the crown, but the power of influence, the ability to guide a kingdom even when the reins of power were in the hands of others. If she could not win Philip IV's love, she would earn his respect. If she could not gain his passion, she would win his trust. Slowly but surely, Elizabeth was becoming the queen that Spain needed, even if that queen was not the one she had dreamed of being. In the early years of their marriage, Elizabeth had hoped for a connection that went beyond the political. She had hoped for a husband who might become a partner, someone with whom she could share both the burdens and joys of being monarch. But that hope had slowly dimmed. Philip IV, though capable in many respects, was not a man of deep emotional ties. His heart, if it existed outside his love for art and culture, was a mystery to Elizabeth. He seemed more a servant of his own court than its king, more lost in his introspection than in the leadership of a nation. He ruled not through action but through passive governance, surrounded by ministers who manipulated the system to their advantage. Philip was the embodiment of a king trapped in a gilded cage, while Elizabeth, sharp and ambitious, found herself trying to fill the void left by his neglect. As the years passed, Elizabeth began to understand the subtle art of navigating the complex web of the Spanish court. She had learned that power at court was not always in the hands of those who wore the crown, but rather in those who whispered into the ears of the king. It was the ministers, the noble families, the influential men and women who could shape the course of Spain's future. And if Elizabeth could align herself with the right people, if she could gain their trust, she would have the influence to ensure Spain's future. It was during these formative years that Elizabeth became close to several key figures in the court. Though she could never fully trust them, she began to realize that they, too, were playing the same game of power that she was. She began to use her position not just as a figurehead, but as a subtle and calculating force that moved behind the scenes. Ministers like Gaspar de Guzman, Count Duke of Olivares, rose to prominence, and Elizabeth, ever the student of power, saw in him both a potential ally and a dangerous adversary. Olivares, with his keen mind and sharp political instincts, was a man who could shape Spain's future, but he was also a man who could destroy anyone who stood in his way. It was in her dealings with Olivares that Elizabeth truly began to test the limits of her influence. Early on, she recognized that his ambitions were vast and far-reaching, and while he was initially wary of her, he could not deny the strength of her position. Elizabeth did not openly oppose him. Instead, she allowed him to make his moves, carefully watching from the sidelines, all the while ensuring that her own position remained secure. She began to understand the delicate balance of alliances at court, where the slightest misstep could spell disaster. Olivares' relationship with Philip IV was complex. He was both a trusted advisor and a manipulative figure who sought to centralize power under the king, often at the expense of the nobility. Elizabeth saw in him a potential ally, someone who could help her secure her position, but she also saw a man whose ambitions could one day outstrip her own. Yet Elisabeth was not merely an observer. Over time, she became more involved in the political discussions that took place in the royal court. She made her presence felt. Though never overtly, her advice, subtle and measured, was respected by those who understood the power of quiet diplomacy. When matters of state arose, Elisabeth was there, offering her counsel to Philip, making suggestions to the ministers, and gradually gaining influence in ways that were not immediately apparent to those around her. In one particular moment, as the Habsburg Empire's resources dwindled and Spain's military campaigns continued to drain the royal coffers, Elisabeth saw an opportunity to align herself with the reformers at court who sought to centralize control and bring order to the chaos. Olivares, who had grown more powerful with each passing year, was pushing for sweeping reforms that would tighten the crown's hold over the restive provinces of Spain. Elisabeth, keenly aware of the unrest in Spain's far-flung territories, offered her support to Olivares' plan, but only in a way that served her own interests. She subtly used her influence over Philip IV to push for policies that would benefit her and her family, all while maintaining the appearance of loyalty to the crown. In the political games that defined the Spanish court, loyalty was often a facade, and Elisabeth played the game with unmatched precision. She knew when to push, when to retreat, and when to stand silent, observing the movements of those around her. And as the years wore on, she realized that her power, while not overt, was becoming undeniable. She was a queen who had learned to maneuver in the shadows, guiding Spain's policies and decisions without ever appearing to do so. Her role as a mother, too, became a crucial part of her political strategy. The weight of producing an heir to the throne was ever present. Spain needed a king who could secure its future, and Elisabeth's role in that mission was not to be underestimated. For years, she struggled with the pressure to provide Philip with a son, a task that was increasingly urgent as the stability of the Spanish Empire began to fray. But despite her best efforts, the birth of a male heir remained elusive. Elisabeth's frustration mounted as each failed pregnancy deepened the scrutiny on her role as queen. The court, ever watchful, began to murmur, and Elisabeth found herself the subject of gossip and speculation. Her inability to produce a son became the topic of whispered conversations, and the weight of those expectations bore down on her, making her feel as though she was failing not only her husband but the entire kingdom. But Elisabeth was no stranger to adversity. She had grown up in a world where politics and power were the currency of survival. Her relationship with Philip IV, though distant, was not a failure in her eyes. It was a partnership of necessity, one in which both parties had their roles to play. She understood that her power did not lie solely in her ability to produce an heir, but in her ability to influence the future of Spain, in her capacity to strengthen the monarchy through her alliances and political maneuvering. If she could not provide a male heir, then she would ensure that her influence in the court remained as strong as ever. She would be the queen who could guide Spain, even without the title of Mother of the King. The arrival of her daughter, Margaret Theresa, in 1651, though a cause for celebration in the court, did little to alleviate the pressure on Elisabeth. A daughter could not secure the Habsburg dynasty. Still, Elisabeth did not lose hope. In a court ruled by political necessity, the birth of a daughter was not an end but a beginning. Margaret Theresa, though a girl, was her daughter, and she would be raised to understand the same delicate dance of politics that Elisabeth had learned so well. As the years passed, Elisabeth's influence in the court continued to grow. The complexities of her marriage to Philip IV remained. But Elisabeth was no longer the naive young princess who had first arrived in Spain. She had learned to navigate the court's intrigues, to understand the ambitions of the men around her, and to play her role with quiet dignity. She had become not just the queen consort of Spain, but a powerful force in her own right, one whose subtle influence shaped the direction of the kingdom. Yet, despite her growing power, Elisabeth remained ever conscious of the fragile nature of her position. The world of the Spanish court was one of fleeting alliances, shifting loyalties, and constant danger to be a woman in a man's world. Even a queen consort was to live in a constant state of vigilance. But Elisabeth was nothing if not resilient. She had learned that power could be wielded in many forms, not always through force, but through influence, intellect, and the careful use of silence. In a kingdom on the brink of collapse, Elisabeth would prove that she was a queen who could not only endure but shape the future of Spain in ways no one had anticipated. As the years passed, Elisabeth of Bourbon's power at the Spanish court grew more formidable. Though it remained shrouded in subtlety and discretion, the politics of the Spanish Empire, long dominated by the conflicting ambitions of its ministers, the restive nobility, and the vast network of local leaders, was becoming an increasingly fragile system. The great Habsburg dynasty, once the dominant force in Europe, was now mired in struggles, both internal and external. The grip of Philip IV, though still formidable, was weakening, and in the absence of his leadership, it was Elisabeth who had begun to hold the threads of influence together. Though Philip, with his passion for the arts and his deep introspection, remained a figurehead, it was Elisabeth who quietly steered the ship of state. The early years of her reign had been characterized by uncertainty, but Elisabeth had proven herself capable of navigating the treacherous political waters. Her relationship with Philip was, by now, a complicated balance of duties and personal isolation. The king, despite his quiet affection for her, remained distant. His attention, though kind at times, often drifted elsewhere, to the works of Velázquez and the development of the Spanish court as a center of artistic excellence. The marriage, though politically significant, remained emotionally distant. Elisabeth knew that she would never capture the full affection of Philip, but over time, she had come to realize that love was a luxury that the throne could not afford. Loyalty, however, was another matter entirely. Elisabeth's primary role, as the queen consort of Spain, was to secure the future of the Habsburg dynasty, and it was here that her true strength as a ruler began to emerge. The question of succession had loomed over Spain for years, as the failure of several royal marriages and the pressures of war had strained the royal line. Despite the political stakes, Elisabeth's personal anguish over her inability to provide Philip with a male heir had become a constant shadow. The years of pregnancy and loss, compounded by the court's scrutiny, had taken a toll on her spirit, yet her resilience never wavered. The birth of her daughter, Margaret Theresa, had brought both joy and disappointment. A girl could not inherit the throne, and so the weight of the kingdom's future remained squarely on Elisabeth's shoulders. She had come to understand that Spain's future lay not just in a male heir but in the preservation of its power and influence. The court, with its rampant factionalism and power struggles, required strong leadership that Elisabeth could provide, even if her own hopes for personal fulfillment had dimmed. As she watched her daughter grow, Elisabeth poured all her ambition into Margaret Theresa. She would be raised not as a fragile princess but as a future queen, ready to wield power in her own right. But it wasn't just about preparing her daughter for the throne. Elisabeth had come to understand that the world around her was shifting. The Spanish Empire, once the mightiest in Europe, was in decline. The resources of the kingdom were strained, its wars increasingly futile, and the weight of governance grew heavier with each passing year. It was clear that Spain's hold on its empire, especially its territories in the Netherlands and the Americas, was beginning to slip. The once great naval force, the symbol of Spain's dominance, was faltering. Elisabeth knew that the future of Spain depended on careful diplomacy and shrewd alliances. Her relationship with Philip IV, while never one of deep emotional intimacy, was marked by mutual respect. The king, though often distant, recognized her intelligence and ability to maneuver within the complicated politics of the court. Their marriage had become one of convenience, but it was also one of necessity. Philip needed Elisabeth to help preserve the integrity of his rule, and she, in turn, needed his support to maintain her growing influence. But as Elizabeth became more adept in her role, she began to wonder if there was more to power than the quiet maneuvering that had so far defined her reign. The Spanish court, which had once been a place of splendor and prestige, had become a hotbed of intrigue. The nobility was divided, the ministries were rife with corruption, and the kingdom itself seemed on the brink of collapse. Though Philip's reign had seen its share of victories, they were often tempered by the failures of the empire's expansionist policies and the growing cost of war. Elizabeth understood that, like the kingdom, the monarchy itself was fragile. She was not the first queen consort to wield influence behind the scenes, but her influence was becoming more pronounced, more recognized. She was no longer simply a queen by title, but a queen in practice. One of the key moments in Elizabeth's rise to power came in the form of her relationship with Gaspar de Guzman, the Count Duke of Olivares. Olivares had served as Philip IV's chief minister for much of his reign, and his vision for Spain was both ambitious and controversial. His attempt to centralize the crown's power and reduce the influence of the nobility had earned him the ire of many. Yet, despite the resentment he inspired in certain quarters, Olivares was a man whose political acumen Elizabeth came to respect. She had long recognized that the true power in Spain lay not in the hands of Philip IV, but in those who had the king's ear, and over time, Elizabeth came to see Olivares as an unlikely ally. Olivares was a man of grand ideas, some of which had the potential to stabilize Spain and return it to its former glory. However, he was also a man with many enemies, and Elizabeth knew that his continued influence depended on her ability to navigate the complex and often treacherous currents of the court. She began to align herself more closely with Olivares, supporting his reforms, even as she remained cautious of his growing ambitions. The court's reaction to her alliance with Olivares was mixed. Some saw it as a wise political move, while others viewed it as a dangerous shift in power. The result, however, was clear. Elizabeth's influence at court was growing, and her ability to sway key decisions was no longer in question. While Elizabeth's political influence grew, so did the pressure to secure a male heir. The birth of a son had been the kingdom's greatest hope, but it had remained an elusive dream. For a time, Elizabeth's personal struggles with motherhood seemed to mirror the struggles of the kingdom itself. Both were in a state of perpetual expectation, never fully realized. Yet, despite the hardships, Elizabeth remained steadfast in her role. She knew that her greatest contribution to Spain's future would not come through her ability to bear children, but through her capacity to guide the kingdom through its period of uncertainty. In the early 1650s, Spain found itself embroiled in a series of military conflicts, both in Europe and in its overseas territories. The Spanish Netherlands, in particular, had become a thorn in the side of the Spanish crown, as the Dutch resistance to Spanish rule continued to intensify. The war, long drawn out, had drained Spain's resources, and Elizabeth saw that if Spain were to maintain its influence on the European stage, it would need a new strategy. She began to take a more active role in shaping Spain's foreign policy, quietly advocating for peace with the Dutch and supporting efforts to strengthen Spain's alliances with other European powers. The Spanish Empire was slowly losing its grip on the territories it once held so firmly, and Elizabeth knew that the future of Spain depended on adaptation. But the larger political picture was far from clear. Despite Elizabeth's efforts, Philip IV's indecision, coupled with Olivares' eventual fall from power, created a period of instability in the court. The nobility, sensing weakness in the crown, began to assert their own power, and the kingdom's political landscape became more fragmented. Elizabeth, though still powerful, found herself facing a new challenge, navigating a divided court where the factions of the nobility, the clergy, and the military were all vying for control. It was in this climate of division that Elizabeth began to see the true cost of her position. The court was no longer a place where power could be easily consolidated. It was now a battleground. The growing animosity between the various factions within the court put a strain on Elizabeth's alliances. and her once secure position began to feel more precarious. Yet, despite the growing tensions, Elisabeth remained a figure of quiet authority. Her influence was not based on force, but on the relationships she had built over the years, her careful handling of the court's delicate balance, and her ability to navigate the complex web of Spanish politics. Through it all, Elisabeth's legacy began to take shape. She was not the passionate ruler that some had hoped for, but she was a queen whose intellect, diplomacy, and steady hand had helped guide Spain through some of its darkest years. Though she had never fully captured the heart of her husband, she had captured the respect of the court. She had proven herself to be a queen not just by title, but by action. And as Spain entered a new chapter, Elisabeth of Bourbon stood as one of the last great figures of the Habsburg dynasty, a queen who had not only survived but thrived in an era of uncertainty. By the mid-1650s, Elisabeth of Bourbon's influence at the Spanish court was irrefutable. The political landscape of Spain had shifted dramatically, shaped by her quiet and strategic maneuvering. What had begun as a marriage of political necessity had transformed into a partnership of mutual respect. Albeit one defined by distance, her role as consort had evolved beyond the traditional expectations of a queen, and she was now a silent yet powerful force in the governance of Spain. Yet, even as she gained power, the kingdom that she served was in decline, and Elisabeth could not escape the harsh reality that her reign would be remembered for more than just her political acumen. It would be marked by the unraveling of Spain's imperial ambitions and the fragility of the Habsburg dynasty. The political environment had become more volatile, the cracks in the empire deepening as Spain faced mounting military defeats, economic instability, and internal strife. The 30 Years' War had taken its toll, not just on Spain's military resources, but on its reputation as the preeminent power in Europe. France had risen to prominence. The Dutch were no longer a subject of Spanish control, and the once great Spanish Armada had dwindled into a shadow of its former self. In the midst of these struggles, Elisabeth had to navigate a court that had grown more fractious. The power of the nobility was expanding as the king's control weakened, and the influence of royal ministers like Olivares, once so central to the court, had waned. Spain was in the midst of a quiet crisis, one that demanded a delicate balance of diplomacy, governance, and survival. Despite these challenges, Elisabeth was steadfast in her role as queen. Her ability to maintain a grip on her position in the face of political uncertainty spoke to her resilience and intelligence. She had learned over the years to maneuver behind the scenes, shaping decisions and quietly influencing outcomes. She no longer waited for Philip's direction. She took charge in her own way, acting as a mediator between the various factions at court, smoothing over tensions, and ensuring that the kingdom did not descend into outright chaos. But even she could not escape the pressures mounting on Spain's once thriving empire. The state of her marriage to Philip IV, too, had evolved. It had been a long time since their first meeting, and their relationship had changed as both had aged. Philip's health was in decline, and his political disengagement had become more pronounced. As a monarch, he was still respected, but his reign had become increasingly ceremonial. He spent more time with his art collection, often retreating into the comfort of his paintings and tapestries, while his ministers and advisors made the real decisions. Elisabeth, who had once harbored hopes of a deeper emotional connection, had come to understand that she would never be the object of Philip's affections. Yet she had accepted the reality of their relationship. Her loyalty to the crown and her sense of duty as queen allowed her to endure the emotional isolation. But even within this quiet marriage, Elisabeth held sway. In those rare moments when Philip turned to her for counsel, it was clear that she possessed a sharp understanding of the empire's delicate state. Her advice, though never loudly proclaimed, was often crucial to the king's decision-making. She had earned his trust, not through passion, but through reason, diplomacy, and the quiet strength she had shown over the years. Despite this, Elizabeth's most significant contribution to Spain would not come through her relationship with Philip IV or through the birth of a male heir, which had remained elusive. It was through her legacy as a political leader, one who had quietly shaped the kingdom's trajectory even as it teetered on the brink of collapse. She had come to realize that her true power lay not in personal glory, but in the preservation of the crown's integrity. By the early 1660s, the once proud empire was experiencing the consequences of years of military overreach and internal instability. The wars that Spain had fought in Europe had left it economically drained. The Dutch and French had grown in power, and the once great Spanish presence in the Americas was beginning to falter. Elizabeth knew that Spain needed to adapt if it was to maintain its place in Europe. But the king's indecisiveness and the growing influence of the court factions made real change difficult. It was during these tumultuous years that Elizabeth found herself in the company of one of the more consequential figures in her life, her daughter, Margaret Theresa. The arrival of Margaret Theresa had been both a source of personal sorrow and political significance. While a daughter could not inherit the throne, Elizabeth knew that her daughter would one day marry into the Habsburg family in Austria, solidifying ties between the two branches of the family and securing Spain's position in Europe. The marriage negotiations for Margaret Theresa were an example of the kind of diplomacy that Elizabeth had become known for. She had arranged for Margaret Theresa to marry Emperor Leopold I of Austria in a bid to solidify Spain's weakened position. The marriage was to be a symbol of the enduring Habsburg connection, a lifeline for Spain in a world that was quickly changing. The political intricacies of the marriage were a testament to Elizabeth's enduring power at court. She knew that the marriage would not only benefit Spain, but also herself, as it would elevate her daughter to a position of power in the European court. As Margaret Theresa prepared for her marriage, Elizabeth worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that the arrangements were to her satisfaction. The alliance with Austria was not only a diplomatic victory, but a symbolic one. It represented the last hope of Spain's fading power, an attempt to hold onto a dynastic tradition that was now slipping through their fingers. But as the marriage between Margaret Theresa and Leopold I was finalized, Elizabeth began to sense the inevitable end of her own political influence. Her health, which had never been robust, began to decline. Years of political maneuvering and the burden of maintaining Spain's empire had taken their toll on her body. Her once indomitable spirit was beginning to show signs of wear. In the final years of her life, Elizabeth retreated from the public eye, leaving behind a legacy that was complicated and, in some ways, unfinished. The world around her had changed, and so had the kingdom she had devoted herself to. The Habsburg dynasty was no longer the great force it had once been, and the political landscape of Europe had been irrevocably altered. Elizabeth, who had once been the queen consort who quietly shaped the course of history, now found herself a figure of the past. Her final years were marked by reflection on a life spent in the shadows of power. She had navigated a world where women had little control over their own destinies, but had found ways to exert influence when it mattered most. When Elisabeth of Bourbon passed away in 1665, her death marked the end of an era. She had never been a monarch in her own right, but she had been a queen who had shaped the course of history. Her influence at court, her quiet diplomacy, and her ability to navigate the complex political landscape of Spain's decline had ensured that she left her mark on the kingdom. Her death was mourned by those who had known her as the queen who had served her country with devotion, even when it seemed as though the kingdom was lost. Her legacy, however, would live on. The marriage of her daughter to Leopold I, which she had so carefully orchestrated, would prove to be a significant political alliance. Though Spain's power was waning, the Habsburg family remained influential in Europe, and Margaret Theresa's marriage would ensure that Spain continued to have a place at the table of European diplomacy. In the end, Elisabeth of Bourbon's story was one of quiet endurance. She was not the queen who had won the hearts of her people, nor the monarch who had led Spain to great victories, but she was a queen who had navigated the political complexities of her time with wisdom, grace, and an unwavering commitment to the crown. And in that, she had secured a legacy that would echo through history, not as a conqueror, but as a stateswoman who understood the true nature of power.